Nobody knows exactly what death feels like from the inside, but we are getting closer to understanding it than ever before. And what science has found in the last 2 decades is so strange, so counterintuitive, and so philosophically unsettling that it has forced researchers to completely rethink where the boundary between life and death actually is. This is what happens inside your brain when you die. Let us start with what we think we know. The traditional definition of death was simple. The heart stops, blood stops moving, oxygen stops reaching the brain, and within minutes, the brain shuts down. Clean, final, a clear line between alive and dead. Except it is not. And the science of the last 20 years has made that increasingly clear. Here is the first thing that breaks the simple model. The brain does not shut down quietly when it loses oxygen. It does something that nobody expected. It surges. In 2013, researchers at the University of Michigan did something that sounds almost cruel, but produced one of the most important findings in neuroscience of the last decade. They monitored the brain activity of rats in the moments after cardiac arrest. What they found stopped everyone in the lab. In the 30 seconds after the heart stopped, brain activity did not go quiet. It exploded. The brain produced a massive surge of electrical activity, far more intense and coordinated than anything recorded during normal waking consciousness. Gamma waves, the fastest and most complex brain waves associated with high-level conscious processing, spiked to levels that had never been recorded during the animals' lives. The dying brain was, by every electrical measure, more intensely active than it had ever been while alive. This finding has since been replicated and extended. In 2023, researchers published data from human patients who died while wearing EEG monitors in a hospital setting. 2 of the patients who died after having life support withdrawn showed the same surge of gamma wave activity at the moment of cardiac arrest. Gamma waves in the same regions of the brain associated with dreaming, visual processing, memory recall, and conscious experience. We do not know what this means. That is the honest answer. But the implications are enormous. If the brain is generating its most intense conscious activity in the moments after the heart stops, then what does that mean for what the dying person might be experiencing? This brings us to the second thing that breaks the simple model: near-death experiences. For a long time, near-death experiences were dismissed by mainstream science as hallucinations, oxygen deprivation artifacts, or the product of wishful thinking. People who came back from cardiac arrest and reported leaving their bodies, traveling through tunnels of light, seeing deceased relatives, experiencing a profound sense of peace and connectedness were told, politely but firmly, that their brains had simply misfired under extreme stress. The problem with that explanation is that it does not fit the data. The AWARE study, led by Dr. Sam Parnia at New York University, is the most rigorous scientific investigation of near-death experiences ever conducted. Over years of research in multiple hospitals across the United States and Europe, the team interviewed hundreds of survivors of cardiac arrest about their experiences during resuscitation. What they found was consistent enough to be scientifically unsettling. A significant percentage of survivors reported clear, lucid experiences during the period when their hearts were not beating and their brains were receiving no blood flow. Not confused hallucinations, not dreamlike fragments. Detailed, sequential, coherent narratives of what was happening around them, sometimes including accurate descriptions of the resuscitation procedures being performed on their bodies. In a few cases, patients described seeing and hearing things from positions outside their bodies that were later verified as accurate. Verified, not imagined, not confabulated after the fact. Accurate descriptions of events that occurred during a period when the brain should have been producing no conscious experience at all. This does not prove that consciousness survives death. It does not prove that near-death experiences are genuine glimpses of an afterlife. What it does prove, definitively, is that we do not understand consciousness well enough to say with certainty what the brain is and is not capable of generating at the edge of death. Now let us go deeper into the biology. When the heart stops and oxygen delivery to the brain ceases, the clock starts. What follows is not a single event, but a cascade of biological processes that unfold in a specific sequence. The first few seconds, ATP, the energy currency of every cell in the brain, begins to deplete. Neurons start losing their ability to maintain the ion gradients across their membranes that make electrical signaling possible. This is when the surge of activity researchers have recorded may occur, as cells essentially discharge everything they have in a final burst. The first few minutes. Without ATP, ion pumps fail. Sodium floods into neurons. Potassium floods out. The delicate electrochemical balance that allows neurons to communicate collapses. A wave of electrical silence called spreading depolarization moves across the brain like a tide going out. Around 4 to 6 minutes. This is the window that emergency medicine has long treated as the point of no return for brain function. After 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen, the damage to neurons begins to become irreversible under normal conditions. This is why CPR and defibrillation need to happen fast. This is why brain death is assessed in minutes. But here is something remarkable. That 4 to 6 minute window is not fixed. It is temperature dependent. When the brain is cold, its metabolic rate drops dramatically, and neurons can survive without oxygen for far longer than they can at normal body temperature. This is why people who fall into frozen lakes and have no heartbeat for 30 minutes or more have sometimes been successfully resuscitated with full neurological recovery. The cold preserved the brain by slowing everything down. The same principle is now used deliberately in medicine. Therapeutic hypothermia, cooling the body and brain of cardiac arrest survivors to slow metabolic processes, has saved lives and brains that would previously have been lost. The boundary of irreversibility is not where we thought it was, and it keeps moving as medicine improves. Now, we come to the part that is genuinely philosophically disturbing. What is the difference between a brain that is dead and a brain that appears dead? In 2019, scientists at Yale published a study that shocked the medical community. They took pig brains that had been removed from the animals hours after death, when cellular decay had been underway for some time, and they perfused them with an artificial blood substitute containing oxygen, nutrients, and drugs to prevent excessive neural activity. The brains did not regain consciousness. There was no EEG activity suggesting organized thought, but the neurons responded. Synapses fired. Cellular metabolism resumed. The individual cells of the brain began functioning again hours after the brain had been declared dead, when reanimated by the right conditions. The study was immediately controversial and immediately important. It did not mean that consciousness can be restored hours after death. It meant something more unsettling than that. It meant that the cells of the brain do not die at the moment we declare death. They enter a state of suspended function that is, at least in some cases, potentially reversible under conditions we do not yet fully understand. Death, at the cellular level, is not a moment. It is a process, and that process is slower than we thought. This has real implications for how we think about the brain's experience at death. If the cells are still potentially active for longer than we realized, if the electrical surge of activity in the moments after cardiac arrest represents genuine conscious processing, then the phenomenology of dying, the experience of it from the inside, may be far richer and stranger than the simple model of lights going out would suggest. Let us talk about what the dying brain might actually experience. The surge of gamma wave activity recorded in those final moments corresponds to the same kind of neural processing involved in the most vivid conscious experiences a brain can generate. Dreams, memories being recalled with intense clarity, the integration of sensory information into a unified experience of reality. Some researchers have suggested that what near-death experiencers describe, the life review, the sense of timelessness, The feeling of profound clarity and peace may be the experiential correlate of this final surge, that the brain, in its last electrical gasp, is somehow running its most complex and integrative processes, pulling together memory, sensory experience, and emotional processing in a way that creates something that feels, from the inside, like the most real experience of a lifetime. This is speculative. Everything at this edge of knowledge is speculative. But it is speculative in a direction that the data supports. There is also the chemistry. In the moments of extreme physiological stress that accompany dying, the brain releases a flood of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. Endorphins, the brain's natural painkillers, flood the system. Serotonin and dopamine levels shift dramatically. And there is growing evidence that the brain may release dimethyltryptamine, DMT, a compound structurally similar to serotonin that produces the most intense altered states of consciousness ever recorded in human subjects. DMT is produced endogenously by the human brain. Studies in rats have shown elevated DMT levels during cardiac arrest. Whether this happens in humans at death and whether it contributes to near-death experiences is still being investigated. But the chemistry is real, and the possibility is being taken seriously by researchers who would not have touched the topic a decade ago. So what do we actually know? We know the dying brain surges with electrical activity of a kind and intensity not seen during ordinary life. We know that some people have coherent, accurate experiences during periods when their brains should be producing nothing. We know that death at the cellular level is a process, not a moment, and that the timeline of irreversibility keeps being pushed further out as medicine advances. We know that the chemistry of the dying brain is unlike anything experienced during normal life. And we know that consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, remains so poorly understood that we cannot rule out almost anything about what the brain might be generating at its edge. What we do not know is the most important thing of all. We do not know whether there is something it is like to be a brain dying. We do not know whether the surge of activity in those final moments corresponds to any form of experience at all. We do not know where the boundary between the end of consciousness and the end of life actually falls. The honest answer to what happens inside your brain when you die is this: something happens. Something we did not expect. Something that does not fit the simple model. And science is only beginning to understand what that something might be.